Every once in a while, I toss out a top 10 list because I think it's fun to dialogue about such things, although this by definition is a monologue. But it usually sparks dialogue. Almost every time I do a top 10 list, Steve McClendon comes up to me afterwards and gives me his number one. And I can't believe you missed this one. So, Steve, I think I got this one right, though. I think you're going to agree with me, at least the top one on this one. I'm going to do the top 10 arch nemeses of all time. And so here they go. These are the ones I came up with. You have to start with the coyote against the roadrunner. Number 9, I have Voldemort against Harry Potter. Can't leave out current happenings in pop culture there. Moriarty against Sherlock Holmes. I have to do a caveat there with Moriarty. I actually read the entire Sherlock Holmes series by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Moriarty's like hardly even in those. But when you watch it on TV or in a movie or something, Moriarty's always there. So I'm going to have to go with the TV version of Moriarty against Sherlock Holmes. Number 7, Marie Barone against Deborah in Everybody Loves Raymond, arch nemesis. Number 6, Lex Luthor against Superman. Number 5, Captain Hook against Peter Pan. Number 4, the Wicked Witch of the West against Dorothy. Number 3, Ernie the Giant Chicken against Peter Griffin. If you know it, you know it. If you don't, you don't. Number 2, Darth Vader against Luke Skywalker. And number 1, I don't want to hear any argument about this, Steve McClendon, Boris and Natasha against Rocky and Bullwinkle. Number 1 arch nemesis of all time. And I say these, or I throw these out, because as I look at the passage in the Sermon on the Mount on treasure and money and those sorts of things, I'm trying to discern the relationship between God and money in the text. And I think it's so easy for us to look at the text and ask this question, well, does this mean that money is a villain? Like it's like this arch nemesis of God in the way that it's being presented. And I don't really see that at all. I don't believe this text is necessarily about God and money at all. It's about money and us. And in that light, money or the love of money can be said to be the arch nemesis of our soul. Let's pick up Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount, in verse 19. Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, the whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, then the whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve 2 masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Let's break this down for a little bit and see if we can't get to the bottom of what's going on. For starters, the Greek word that is used for money is used only here and in Luke's version of this exact same story. And the King James actually gets this right, I think, over the other translations in calling or translating this word mammon. Mammon is actually a Chaldean or Syrian word that means money god. And it harkens back to less subtle days when people actually worshiped ideas that were the personification of the desires of their heart. For example, back in the day, people would worship Baal. Baal was the god of weather and the elements and all things unknown. And so you worshiped Baal if the number one concern of your heart, if the driving concern of your heart was fear of the unknown, fear of the future. If you desired personal security, then you would become a worshiper of Baal, or at least that's how people thought back in that day. Back in that time, they also worshipped Asherah, and then later on Aphrodite, who was a fertility goddess, and had temples all throughout the ancient world with temple prostitutes. And people worshipped Asherah and Aphrodite if their number one passion in life was their passions. You know, if they wanted to express those kinds of passions, and that's what they were all about, then they would become worshipers of Asherah. People back then sometimes would even worship a god called Molech. Molech set himself up as a king and a rival to the Lord of heavens, to the God of heavens, and he demanded child sacrifice. And people would sacrifice children to Molech to ensure continued blessing and prosperity. And so if your number one overriding concern in life was personal comfort and well-being, then you worshiped Molech. And then there was Mammon, or the money god. And apparently people worshipped Mammon. But the interesting thing about Mammon is we cannot find any ancient temples or discover any ancient rites that had to do with Mammon. In fact, it seems that Mammon's temple was the market, and the rites of Mammon were profit and the accumulation of goods and avarice. And this certainly seems to be consistent with what we see in this particular passage from Jesus, because he talks about, metal. And back then, metal was very rare. And worked metal was even rarer still. And if you had a piece of worked metal that was maybe a design in your house or on your wall, or maybe in the form of an idol or something like that, it meant that you were very wealthy. It was an object that brought status and was an indication of success. But the problem with metal, and you know this about metal, and the metal we have today is far superior to the metals they had back then, but metals back then would rust. And so they had to be very, very careful with their metals. And so as much as those things were worth, over the course of a few years, they might, be very worthless because of rust and things like that. There's a reference there to moths, and what he's talking about are fancy clothes and silks, which were also a measure of status and wealth. I guess they probably are in just about every culture, and that culture was no exception. And if you could afford, big fancy voluminous robes with tassels and all sorts of trimmings and things like that, that was a status that you were somebody. But again, they weren't on top of the insect problem, and they weren't as advanced as we are, and so moths were prevalent, and moths would come in and eat your fancy clothes. And of course, gold and silver coin, or really in any form, is always coveted and always hoarded, but they didn't have banks back in that day. And so people often had strong boxes that were difficult to move, that were hard for thieves to get into. But really what most people would do is they would hide their valuables. They would hide their gold. They would have a false compartment in a wall behind a piece of furniture. They would put it in the ground and hide it, and they would make sure that no one would see them doing it, because if people knew where they hid their gold and their silver, then the thieves would break in and steal it. Now, you worshipped Mammon if you measured your self-worth and value by your net worth and possessions. You worshipped Mammon if you experienced a catharsis in ownership and accumulation that just soothed and settled and satisfied your soul. If you were impressed with your own status and success, and if you were despondent by your lack thereof. if you meticulously and ruthlessly guarded what you had and fought like banshees to keep it. Now, Jesus, in essence, names mammon as something of an archenemy of our souls. Because let's be honest, Baal back in Jesus' time had kind of run its course. People were a little more sophisticated. It was a new day. They were more enlightened in that. And there were not a lot of people in first century Palestine running around worshiping Baal. There were other gods, new gods, that were around in that particular time, but Baal wasn't that big. Aphrodite, I guess, was probably, pretty big in certain parts of the empire, back in that time. But, Molech also, not a lot of child sacrifice going on. But Mammon, Mammon was kind of king. And it may have been a blind spot for the culture. They may not even have realized that mammon was that big of an issue for them, because it's like that with us. It's no big deal, right? People in society, they work and they save and they do the things they do, and nobody really faults them for that. You go out and you earn money and you accumulate money, because that, for some of us, kind of becomes the goal in life. And so Jesus names mammon as this very subtle, this very dangerous God that is somewhat of an arch villain for us. And that mammon is something that we ought to be very, very careful about in our own lives. Now, what a message for us today. I cannot think of a more practical discussion regarding life and meaning and purpose and how we direct our lives and how we live our lives, really, than a discussion about mammon. And Jesus talks all around this, and in doing so, he asks, I believe, some very important questions, some very key, critical questions, if we are going to experience spiritual life and health and freedom and satisfaction. And so I would like to kind of pull some questions out of the text and kind of hang the message on these questions, because I believe that they are important questions for all of us to ask if we are going to have spiritual health in our lives. The first question is simply this: what is treasure? What is most important? What is there in life that is worth truly investing our lives in? And Jesus says, let me give you a hint. I'll give you a clue. It's not money. Because money is temporary. Ultimately, it will go away. One way or the other, ultimately, your money will not last, or your material possessions will not last. Second, that money is a bad master. Money will kill your soul. Third, money impedes our ability to serve God. Now, he's not necessarily saying that being spiritual and having money are mutually exclusive. What he's saying is that if you have money and you are spiritual, a day and time is going to come at some point when you are going to have to choose between the two, and what you choose is going to determine your allegiance. Now, this is instinctive. I think it's instinctive. We kind of know this stuff, that earthly treasures, material things are temporal and ultimately unsatisfying, where spiritual things, the treasures of heaven, are eternal and ultimately the most satisfying for our lives. And to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, I want to backtrack just a bit and define the kingdom once again, because I think the kingdom has to be before us all the time, because we're in the Sermon on the Mount. Right? This is the context. The context is what it is to be a citizen of the kingdom. And so what is the kingdom? Well, the kingdom, according to the verses just prior to this that we just finished in the Lord's Prayer, teaches, again, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that the kingdom is where God is king and his will holds sway. And so what is God's will? Well, we talk about this. Well, God's will is, or it flows from his nature, his person, his character. And so where we find God's will, God's nature, God's person expressed, we find the kingdom. It's where we find love, joy, peace, grace, mercy, salvation, forgiveness, beauty, truth, wisdom. When we see these things, we see the kingdom of God. And of course, this exists perfectly in heaven because God's will is done perfectly in heaven. But in this context, and again, Jesus just finished explaining this in the Lord's Prayer, these are the treasures of heaven. And so Jesus is saying is that we seek the treasures of heaven, or that we should seek the treasures of heaven versus the treasures of this world. And the kingdom citizen knows this to be true. Because the kingdom citizen understands that the treasures of heaven are eternal and ultimately far more satisfying than the treasures of this earth. And so we seek the treasures of heaven at the expense of the treasures of earth rather than the other way around. Because that's typically how this world operates, right? It's typically the other way around. We seek the treasures of this earth at the expense of the treasures of heaven, and Jesus says, no, you need to flip that. Now, this is a very clear biblical teaching that is often skewed by, or that has spawned reactionary movements throughout history that distort this teaching through unbiblical responses. And the overreaction goes something like this. Okay, Jesus says that we're supposed to serve God and not money. That means money is evil. That means that I need to do away with all my money and get rid of it because it's bad, because money is evil. There was a movement in the early church like this. It was called the ascetic movement. Back in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, these ascetics would go and they'd live out in the wilderness, or they'd live in caves. And they would divulge themselves of every material thing in their lives so there would be no taint of money or mammon on them. And their idea was that they needed to separate themselves from anything that was possibly commercial or consumer or materialistic at all. So if they wore nice clothes, then that was a sign that they were not very spiritual. If they lived in a house like everyone else did, then they weren't spiritual. And so they would go out and they would live like animals so they could be spiritual and have absolutely nothing to do with the material. And they thought they were so spiritual and so superior to all of those people that stayed, back in society and were enslaved by the god of mammon. Back in the 60s, in recent memory, sometimes Christians would get together in communes and they would pool all their resources so that no one person owned anything. Within the last 5 or 6 years, there's another movement that has been gaining tremendous momentum, and it's the movement to simplify. And I think some people have taken even that movement to an extreme, because they are encouraging people who are middle class and certainly upper class to liquefy their assets and give those things away to the poor so that they can live simply in lower class, a lower class lifestyle. I've read numerous times from numerous different authors and numerous different sources who are all a part of this movement who say that it is actually a sin for a Christian to be rich. That all Christians, by God's design, it is God's will for you to be poor. I don't think Jesus is talking about that. I also believe this denies the witness of Scripture. Jesus is teaching against mammon. He is speaking against serving money, not having money. And there is a world of difference. There is a huge distinction between the two. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. Second, nowhere in Scripture does Jesus say, or does the Scripture say, that it's a sin to be rich, nor that we should give away what we have for the sake of giving it away. In fact, many Bible heroes were wealthy people. Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, was a very wealthy man, as were his sons, Isaac and Jacob, and the patriarchs down the line were people who were very blessed people. Job was blessed. Solomon, King David, these were wealthy people. Even in the New Testament, we find wealthy people playing some very key roles in a very positive way. Joseph of Arimathea giving a tomb to Christ. Many people believe that Mary and Martha were wealthy and helped bankroll much of the ministry of Christ. And we know that there were other people who did bankroll much of the ministry of Christ to enable him to go out and be the teacher that he was. And nowhere in Scripture does it teach that this wasn't a blessing from God. In fact, it teaches the opposite, that the things that they had were blessings from God and were meant to be enjoyed, that he encourages us to enjoy the blessings that he gives us. 1 Timothy chapter 6 is one such passage. Starting in verse 17, Paul says to Timothy, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up for themselves treasure as a firm foundation for the coming age, so they may take hold of the life that is truly life." Now, this is a parallel passage to the one that we're looking at, and it's addressed specifically to the rich. It's addressed specifically to wealthy people. And it doesn't say that they're wrong or that they're sinful or that they're supposed to give their stuff away, just for the sake of giving it away. No, it tells them to put their trust in God rather than in the wealth that they have, and it tells them to be rich in generosity and good deeds. And so what we have here is a very similar message. It's a caution to them that don't let your wealth get in the way of your relationship with God. That you should store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, and it actually uses that term, rather than accumulate treasure on earth. That you should take what God has given you and use it as a resource for the kingdom of God. That is in essence the message. But in no way does it say that you having money is bad and that you should get rid of it. So the first question is, what is treasure? The second question I believe this text asks us or encourages us to ask is this: is money a means or an end? Now again, this is one of those no-brainer type questions, but I ask it anyway because it's a question that we have a tendency to get wrong because we don't think. We just act. And I think one of the problems with our culture and one of the problems with mammon in general is that money becomes an end and not necessarily a means to an end. Now, I would say that although our society is generally this way, that this is one area where our values in some places are starting to change, where we are starting to reflect on this as a society, and we're starting to come to some other conclusions, and I think this in a very healthy way. For example, I was walking through Barnes & Noble the other day, and a retirement book caught my eye. And it caught my eye not because it was a retirement book, but because it was a retirement book with a completely different premise from every other retirement book. And the premise was this: that many people, if not most people, do not retire well because they only prepare financially. because they spend their years, their time getting ready for retirement, working like crazy, squirreling away every nickel they have so that they can retire well in their minds. But then once they retire, they have absolutely no idea who they are. They haven't prepared and done the things that lead to a rich life after they retire. And so the book is all about not investing necessarily as much or everything that you are in money and the pursuit of money, but focusing on your relationships. Focusing on your relationship with your family. Building deep friendships with like-minded people. Developing ties to your community and getting involved with your community. Getting involved with your church and having a spiritual dimension to your life. Having different things that you do to give back and ways that you serve and hobbies and all of these different things so that you then can retire well. And it's not just older people that are thinking this way. Younger people are thinking this way too. My oldest daughter came home last Christmas, not this past one, but the one prior to that. She came home all excited and wanting the whole family to watch this documentary on tiny houses. You ever heard about the tiny house movement? All of these, young millennial hipster types, or not all of them, but some of them are now wanting to live in these 100 to 200 square foot homes. And they're actually amazing. The documentary's on Netflix. I mean, you can watch it. It's very interesting. They live in these homes, and the purpose is so they will not be slaves to money. They don't care about a big house and fancy cars and all the responsibilities that go with it. They want the financial freedom and independence to live life the way that they want. And some of these people are highly educated, and yet they work in coffee shops and bookstores, and they're able to travel and do these things because, they don't have this high consumptive lifestyle that they need to necessarily maintain. And so there's a lot of this younger crowd that is beginning to break that hold that money has on them as a culture. But I think I would caution us by saying some, because we all know that probably the majority of us in society probably are still in a position where money may have quite a hold on us. This is kind of what Jesus is talking about, but not exactly. Was talking with a church member not too long ago about these very types of things, and I think she hit it right on the head. She asked, why is it, and both she and her husband work, why is it that we just work and work and work and work just so we can have more stuff? And she says, and begin to describe how she and her husband are now developing a plan so they can get off what they call the money train. So they can downsize and simplify so that, in her words, they can have more time to be with family and friends, and more time to serve God, and have more in the way of being generous, being generous of more of their stuff for the Lord instead of just piling it all up for themselves. And so, I think this passage causes us to ask that very question. Is money a means or an end? And it's a challenge for us because many of us have developed a very high consumptive lifestyle that we must work like crazy in order to sustain. And so maybe a really good question that comes from this is, how can we simplify so that we can be more generous and serve God? What steps can we take to be more generous and to serve God with our lives? How can we be intentional with our lives? And I think that's what the church member I was talking about was referring to. I'm sure that they're going to be comfortable, but they're also going to be intentional. And really, that's the bottom line of this question. Is money an end or a means to an end? And how can we be intentional in doing it the right way? Third question this text asks is, what are you serving? First two questions, rather philosophical. What is treasure? Is money a means to an end? Things we can sit around and debate. This next question is very, very personal. You know, Jesus, and it goes with the flow of the text too. You know, Jesus throws out some stuff about treasure and priorities, and now he wants to know where we stand on this. Where are you on this? And this whole teaching, that's what this whole teaching about the eye being the lamp of the body is about. And a lot of people read that particular part of this text, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it's the idea that, if you cover your eyes, you're blind, you're in darkness, so to speak. And people like that, may think they know what's going on because they're listening, maybe they're talking to people, they think they know what's going on around them, but it's very easy to mislead them. They may not perceive reality in the way that they think. Their perception and their perspective on the world limits them to see things clearly. However, someone who is healthy and sees with their eyes is not so easily misled because they see what's happening. They're enlightened, so to speak. They're not in the dark, so to speak. They know the truth. Dallas Willard, in talking about these verses, says, the person who treasures what lies within the kingdom sees everything in its true worth and relationship. The person who treasures what is on earth, by contrast, sees everything from a perspective that distorts it and systematically misleads in practice. The relative importance of things is, in particular, misperceived. In other words, when we treasure the wrong things, it distorts our perspective on the world. For example, take someone who is addicted to drugs or alcohol. They oftentimes will perceive the whole world through the lenses of their next drink or their next high or fix or whatever. And so they do destructive things. They make poor choices. They do things that others would look at them and say, that is not rational. That's not reasonable. That's not wise. Why? Because they're blinded by their addiction. Jesus is in essence saying likewise that those who serve mammon are blinded by their addiction to mammon. They treasure the wrong thing. They serve mammon. Think Ebenezer Scrooge in what he was about. That's someone who serves mammon. Gordon Gekko, or for you sci-fi nerds, Quark, the Ferengi merchant on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. These are people whose love of money distorts their very perceptions of reality and everything that goes with it. And this is what happens when we love something so much that it supplants God as the number one priority in our lives. It's dangerous. We do not see the world clearly. Our priorities get mixed up. We make poor choices. People look at us, people who see clearly look at us and see that that's not wise or reasonable or rational because we are not seeing things clearly. And this is what happens when we serve the wrong thing. So question number one, what is treasure? Question number two, is money a means or an end or a means to an end? Question number three, what are you serving? And then question number four is the most pointed of all. Are you serving money? Or is money serving you? Some people may very naturally kind of push back and say, well, why do I necessarily have to serve anything? I'm not a weak person. Nothing is my master. Well, honestly, by definition, we have to serve something. You have to love something most. If you love nothing, you serve nothing, you're dead inside at that point. And so there is something that you love most. There is something that drives and directs your life more than anything else, and that is what you serve. Bob Dylan got it right in that self-titled song. You have to serve somebody. He said, you may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble. You might like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls. But you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Dylan gets it right. There is no spiritual Switzerland. We all have allegiances. And one of the easiest allegiances for us to have is money. Because it's natural. It's easy. It's common. Everybody's doing it. A few years back, there was a reality show kind of like The Bachelor called Joe Millionaire. And the premise behind Joe Millionaire is they recruited these 20 nice-looking young women to vie for the attention of this guy named Joe, who was supposedly this very successful millionaire guy. And they brought them in, and they did. They pursued this guy with abandon. They were interested in him, and they all wanted to get to know him, and they all wanted to be with him, and they would even sit back and talk about he was going to choose them, and he was going to marry them. The catch was that Joe Millionaire was only made $19,000 a year. They were tricking, all the women. And then, near the end of the show, they then revealed that Joe Millionaire was not a millionaire at all. That he only made $19,000 a year. And most of those women after that wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. They were only pursuing him and a relationship with him and even marriage with him because they thought he had money. What does that say about you? When you are willing to pursue a relationship, when you are willing to pursue marrying an individual, giving yourself for life to an individual, and even doing so and making a spectacle of yourself by doing it on television, what does that say about your willingness to pursue mammon? Guys, that's where our culture is. That's serving mammon. So what about you? What do you serve? Do you serve money or does money serve you? Well, here's some questions. I'll rephrase it and ask it a number of different ways to where maybe we can kind of size up where we are, take a pulse of where we are. Question number one, do I genuinely feel in my heart that everything I have belongs to God? Do I feel that what is mine to do with as I please, or do I see myself as a steward accountable to God? Do I think about money more or spiritual things more? What occupies more of my thoughts? Do I believe that solutions to major life problems are more financial or more spiritual in nature? In other words, what are you looking towards to solve your problems? What would be the big fix for you? Money or your relationship with God? Number 5, do I realize that nearly every financial decision is a spiritual decision? Is supporting God's work a priority in my life? Here's a big one. Have I sacrificed God, family, or friends for financial gain? Have I sacrificed financial gain for God, family, and friends? You turn it around. Are my life goals financial or spiritual in nature? Are my life goals primarily financial or spiritual in nature? Number 10, am I considered a giving and generous person? Do others see me in that way? Number 11, what does my checkbook reveal about my priorities or my credit card statement? Number 12, are there financial sacrifices I would not make even if I knew it was God who asked them? Number 13, and I'm almost finished, when I give to God, do I feel like God owes me? I made this big sacrifice for you, Lord. Now, it's important for you to bless me in some way. You owe me. Is prosperity more important than spirituality, or spirituality more important than prosperity? And last but not least, have I ever done anything unethical or illegal for money? Or would I do anything unethical or illegal for money? These are hard questions. They kind of strip down the illusions that we have of how spiritual we are and reveal our hearts for what's really inside, at least if we answered them honestly. And the bottom line is really this, and it's the primary question of this particular text. And the question is this, and this is how we close, is where's your treasure? Is it God? Is it in God, or is it in mammon? And Jesus seemed to indicate that mammon was kind of the arch nemesis of God in his day. And I believe, hands down, it's the arch nemesis to God in our day for so many people. Where is your treasure? I'm not saying it's a sin to be rich or that living your middle class or upper class lifestyle is wrong, but where is your treasure? And is that reflected in your life? My challenge for us is to simply be more intentional, because we just kind of adopt the prevailing culture around us. And as believers and as Christians, it's important for us to stop and think about such things. How can I change my life? What steps can I take to be more intentional in my life about generosity and serving God and serving others? And do I need to take steps that way? Again, what is my treasure? Where is my treasure? Hopefully, your treasure is the treasure of heaven, as opposed to the treasure of this earth. Because again, the treasure of this earth, material things, temporal, they will disappear, they will go away. There will be a point in your existence, whether it's in this life or the next, that everything that you now have will mean absolutely nothing, zero. But if you have treasure in heaven, where rust cannot destroy, moths cannot destroy, thieves cannot break in and steal. If you have treasure in heaven, that treasure is eternal, and it will be eternally satisfied.